Get out, because I'm moving in with mine. Kevin said these words loudly, pointing at us, and his voice was filled with rage and determination. My gaze met his, and I couldn't hide the disgust that immediately appeared in my chest. He stood in front of me, his hands clenched into fists, and his face was twisted with anger, as if everything he said was the result of long thought and discontent accumulated over months. I could understand his irritation if it was related to something specific, difficulties at work or domestic problems, but at that moment it was clear to me that his anger went much deeper. I felt my insides tighten with an unpleasant realization. My heart skipped a beat, and a strange, heavy noise began to sound in my ears. For a long time, I couldn't take my eyes off his face, which now seemed not so familiar to me. He was so different. Sandy, who was standing next to her, couldn't keep quiet. She flinched at how harsh it sounded and looked sheepishly at her father, who was not going to stop. "Dad, you didn't know?" Her voice was low, but there was so much confusion and surprise in it that even Kevin froze for a moment. His gaze became clouded, and he was clearly puzzled. The silence that followed her words filled the room with an unpleasant heaviness. Everyone in the room instantly stopped their actions. Kevin's mother, McCool, continued to give orders to the movers, not noticing what was happening, but his father, standing a little further away, stopped, as did I. It was as if we all froze at that moment, and it seemed that time did not exist. I couldn't figure out how long it would last. How long will I stand and listen to these accusations and reproaches that did not really happen? I tried to figure out what was going on, but every attempt to organize my thoughts only increased my inner anxiety. I wasn't interested in the situation. I wasn't interested in the behavior of Kevin or his parents. Despite the obvious problems, something about this moment made me think of something else. I had to reveal the truth, even if it meant I had to tear apart the fragile world that Kevin and I had built. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. My name is Dean Anderson. I am 46 years old and I am a remote worker. I have a husband, I have a daughter. We live a seemingly ordinary life. But behind this facade there are years of tense relations, not always harmonious, not always cloudless. I met Kevin a few years ago. We had dates. I felt like he was the right person to spend my life with. His proposal seemed sincere, his love seemed real. I could believe that he and I would be happy. When Kevin proposed to me, I agreed. It was against the background of caring for my mother, her health, which was getting worse every day. Sunday, our daughter, was born shortly after the wedding. Kevin was happy. He was glad for his father. He actively helped me raise my daughter, participated in her life, and I thought that everything would be as we had planned. But every year the situation changed. Sunday was growing up, and I saw how her attitude towards her father was changing. Although she loved him anyway, her gaze became more cautious, more worried. I've noticed Kevin getting annoyed and unhappy. He often complained that I couldn't give him enough time, because all my attention was focused on my mother. His words began to cut painfully, their weight accumulated and became more obvious every day. When Sunday started high school, my mother's health deteriorated, and I had to give up work to be with her. I chose remote work so that I could control everything, provide her with treatment and make sure that she was not left alone in difficult moments. Then Kevin began to express his discontent more and more often. He became more aloof every day, criticizing me more and more for being too focused on my mother. And now, standing in front of him, I felt that I couldn't help but see the truth. I tried to calm Kevin down, but his rage was so fierce that all my words fell on him like water on a stone. I tried to find some explanations, tried to reason with him, but he seemed to be in a state where nothing could awaken in him feelings of guilt or at least understanding. His face was angry and distorted, and his voice was firm and harsh. Sandy, who was standing next to her, took responsibility. She didn't get confused, didn't listen to Kevin's screams, didn't get disappointed. She came up to me, touching my shoulder, and despite the gravity of what was happening, her voice was full of confidence and gentleness. "Mom, leave him to me, you have to go to Grandma," she said with a smile so sincere and kind that it made me feel better, at least for a moment. I always relied on Sunday. Her calmness and reasonableness were my supports in difficult moments. She was my light in this maze of emotions and family dramas. No matter how hard I tried to calm Kevin down, no matter how hard I tried to convince him that his behavior had no basis in fact, all my efforts were in vain. When he burst into reproaches again, I felt that my willpower was leaving me, and my heart was clenching with pain and disappointment. At that moment, Nicole called me. Her name rang, and it took me a moment to figure out exactly what that meant. Her call was unexpected, and even more unexpected were her words. "You've been neglecting my brother lately," she said sharply, and her voice, coming through the phone, was filled with such determination that I stared at the screen in surprise. I thought there was some kind of confusion, that maybe I didn't understand something. But Nicole's name was clearly displayed on the screen, and I couldn't figure out exactly what happened that led to such accusations. "What?" I finally managed to get out of myself. "You've got something mixed up." I didn't neglect Kevin. I was confused, and all I could do in response was deny her accusations. Nicole's words sounded like a bolt from the blue. They didn't make sense. It seemed like everything was the same as before. I continued to take care of Kevin as best I could, but I felt more and more that he was moving away from me. Sunday helped around the house when she returned from school, and I did my best to keep things in order, combining work, caring for a sick mother, and household chores. "Don't pretend," I heard it from my brother, Nicole continued, her voice becoming more and more accusatory. "You neglect the house, you only care about your mother. Can you still proudly call yourself a wife?" I was just stunned by her statement. I couldn't believe she really thought I could forget about home and family. I was always there for him, I didn't leave Kevin. But Nicole didn't see it. Her gaze was so lopsided that I felt vulnerable and unfairly accused. After all, Sandy has always helped, and I never thought that anyone could accuse us of negligence. When I tried to explain that I was doing everything I could, Nicole said something shocking, which was a real blow to me. Unfortunately, it came to this: "Our parents will come and scold you someday too." Those words took me by surprise, and I didn't know what to say. Nicole hung up the phone, leaving me with her unfair, aggressive accusations that I couldn't understand and maybe didn't even deserve. My world shook, and I was left in complete disbelief. My gaze wandered around the room until I felt someone quietly approach from behind. It was Sunday. She was standing in the doorway, her expression wary, as if she had noticed something was wrong without even hearing our conversation. "Mom, I'm home." "What happened?" "You look stunned," she said, approaching and putting her hand on my shoulder. Her concern in her voice made me come to my senses, and I began to regain my composure, although it was still hard and painful inside. I told her about my conversation with Nicole and her accusations, hoping she would help me figure out what was going on. Sunday listened to me in silence, then, without taking her eyes off me, answered. "That's not true, Mom. You're doing everything you can. It's not your fault. I believe you." Her words, however simple, became for me the support that I needed so much at this moment. We continued the conversation, trying to understand what was happening around us, but I knew one thing for sure: I could not allow our relationship to collapse because of unfounded accusations and misunderstandings. Sunday was also shocked. She stood in front of me, her face distorted with anxiety and bewilderment, her eyes widened, and a strange smile trembled faintly from the corners of her lips. When she finally spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the kind I hadn't expected from her. "Hey, Mom," she said, clearly nervous. "I've been thinking about something. Can I talk to you about this? It is important." I nodded, realizing that there was more to her words than just a desire to share her thoughts. It was a serious request. I sat down next to her and we started talking, and the further our conversation went, the more I realized how much this situation was affecting her. Sunday expressed her concerns about what was happening, and I felt really disappointed. Everything that surrounded me in recent weeks was like a fog: Kevin's senseless complaints, Nicole's endless restless calls, my mother-in-law's displeasure, and also this endless anxiety for my mother, whose health was getting worse every day. I sat and listened, and at some point I felt how hard and unbearable it became for me. The feeling of loneliness, mixed with anxiety, was getting more and more overwhelming every day. Sunday tried to help me, but even her support couldn't completely dispel this gloom that had become a part of my daily life. The next day, just a few hours after visiting my mother, I returned home, ready to plunge back into this never-ending routine. I went into the house and immediately noticed the presence of my mother-in-law. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the stove, cooking something that seemed completely unimportant to me against the background of what was happening in my life. I stood in the doorway, not moving, just watching her. She noticed me, her gaze turned slightly cold, and her face tightened. "Oh, you're back," she said with a slight hint of annoyance in her voice. My mother-in-law abruptly stood up, and with as much confidence as only she could do it, she walked towards me. I didn't know what to expect from her visit, but when she walked past me without saying a word and sat down on the sofa, I felt that something important was about to be said. And I was not mistaken. She began her lecture with reproaches. First for my attitude towards Kevin, then for my neglect of household duties, and, of course, there were accusations that I was forcing my husband to do household chores. It was so ridiculous that I could barely hold back a confused look. I was silent, not knowing how to react to her accusations. However, no matter how hard I tried to calm myself down, I couldn't help but notice some inconsistencies in her lecture. My mother-in-law kept talking, but her words became more and more erroneous, ridiculous. "Mom," I began, approaching cautiously, "you're wrong. I've never forced Kevin to do housework. In fact, it almost never helps. Sunday, she's helping me." When I said that, I felt a heavy feeling in my chest. My mother-in-law stood up abruptly, her face flushed, her eyes glittering with anger. "Do you think lying will work on me? Are you saying that my child is lying to me? What a terrible daughter-in-law." Her words hit me like thunder, and before I could say anything, she stormed out of the room without taking a single look at me. With a sound like a storm, she stormed out of the kitchen, leaving the stove on and the whole house in the shadow of her rage. I hurried to turn off the stove, feeling my heart pounding, but did not dare to go after her. I knew that nothing could calm her down at that moment, and any word I said could only make the situation worse. Kevin, meanwhile, was acting strangely. He was in an unusually good mood. His generosity and good nature seemed to have no bounds. He constantly offered to help, but whenever I tried to start a conversation, he seemed to brush me off, cutting off my attempts at conversation, as if we had nothing in common. Sunday noticed this. Her face was also full of bewilderment. We decided to keep quiet, not to get into arguments with Kevin, not to try to analyze his strange behavior. We both felt it was best not to disturb him now. As the days passed, and despite Kevin's strange behavior, I managed to take care of my mother for a while. I thought that maybe his good mood was just a temporary phenomenon, and everything would return to normal, but suddenly there was a terrible loss. My mother passed away quietly. This news shocked me to the core, and despite all the care and worry I've been feeling in recent months, I didn't have the strength to come to my senses. Sandy and I, although overcome with grief, managed to survive the funeral and gradually return to everyday life. But there was something painfully unbearable about sorting out my mother's things in her house. Everything, every corner, was a reminder of her. Even her old books on the shelves, her favorite vase on the table, all seemed to radiate her presence, and although we knew it was necessary, no amount of effort could ease the pain, which only grew stronger with each new object. I tried to ask Kevin for help, but when I mentioned the need for help with things, his reaction was so harsh that it became clear to me that he was avoiding this topic. At that moment, I felt not only disappointment, but also that cold aloofness that seemed to wrap around our relationship with him. So Sunday and I continued to sort things out ourselves. It seemed to us that we weren't making enough progress because every single thing was connected to memories that kept us from moving forward. When evening came, not wanting to leave Sunday alone in this state, I decided to stay the night at my mother's house. I even called Kevin to tell him about it, but despite his calm and relaxed tone, his words sounded like something far away, unreal. "Take your time, relax, you're already there," he said, as if everything around him was so simple. But I felt how hard this simplicity was. It was as if everything around me was losing its meaning. The next morning, after Sunday, and I had taken a small but important step in sorting things out, we decided to return home. As we were approaching our house, I noticed a strange truck parked in front of the entrance. At the same moment, I felt anxiety in my heart. The closer we got, the clearer it became that the truck was loaded with things, and people were bustling around, movers and some unfamiliar faces. My instinct was instantly alert. I quickened my pace, running up to the trucks with Sunday. And then I noticed Kevin, who seemed to notice us before we could get there. He came out to meet me with an expression that I would call icy, but with a hint of pride. His chest bulged out, and he strode towards us with confidence, as if it were his own domain. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying not to betray the wave of panic that swept over me. Kevin looked at us, his face suddenly hard as a rock. "Have you returned yet?" His voice sounded like it wasn't our place. "It's too late for you to change anything." I stood there in a daze, not understanding what was going on. But Kevin didn't wait for my answer. He just pointed at us and said loudly, "I'm moving with my family, so you two need to leave." So far, the movers are receiving instructions from my relatives. His face twisted into an evil grin, and I couldn't help the feeling of disgust that washed over me. How could he do that? How could he announce this at a time like this, when not even a day had passed since my mother's death? But everything seemed so ridiculous that I stood there, unable to utter a word. At that moment, Sandy, who was standing next to me, looked at her father with surprise and confusion. She couldn't seem to figure out what was going on. "Dad, you didn't know?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with bewilderment. These words, uttered with such naivety, were like a bolt from the blue. Kevin was clearly puzzled. He fell silent, as if trying to make sense of what he had said. Sunday, as always, was so sincere that her anxiety was felt in every fiber of her being. At that moment, I noticed that not only Kevin, but also his mother and father, who had previously been busy unloading, also stopped. They all looked at us, froze, as if they didn't know what to do next. But Nicole, as if nothing had happened, continued to give instructions to the movers, not paying any attention to us. She didn't seem to care, and everything that was happening was alien to her. It was so strange and unnatural that I felt something dark and heavy in my soul. I could no longer hide my concern about the behavior of this whole family, but what could I do in such a situation? I was determined to reveal the whole truth, despite the fear and tension that it all created. There was a strong thought inside me that it was time to put all the dots over the "and." I remembered how Kevin and his relatives at that moment, with their arrogant look, began to behave as if this house and everything connected with it already belonged to them. But this was my home, and I couldn't let them forget about it. I approached them, feeling a mixture of indignation and determination boiling inside me. But as it turned out, the words I said were something new and unexpected. I said it without choosing my words. "This house belongs to me." The words sounded with unexpected force for me, and I saw how the reaction of Kevin's relatives changed. They started to panic, their faces turned pale. Nicole, who had been engrossed in the instructions for the movers, was silent for a moment and looked at me, not hiding her surprise and bewilderment. "What are you talking about?" She could barely contain her gaze, trying to figure out what was going on. "You can't afford to build such a beautiful house," she added, as if trying to play along with Kevin, although she clearly felt that her words had no power. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. My answer was full of confidence, despite the fact that everything was boiling inside. "Thanks for the compliment. My father built this house, and it was originally my family's house," I said, feeling my sense of control return with every word. "It was renovated for us by my mother as a wedding gift." These words sounded immutable. I looked at Kevin and his family and saw the confusion on their faces. It was so strange. I couldn't understand how Kevin could forget that the house was actually mine. After all, how could he forget such simple, obvious things? I continued, calmly and confidently, explaining all the details. "This house is registered in my name, and my mother covered the repair costs," I said, looking around at everyone present. "She was happy to move into the apartment so that we could live here happily ever after." Kevin seemed lost. He was stunned and did not know how to respond to such revelations. I could see his mind starting to work at full capacity, trying to find an explanation. But he had no excuses. He should have known, but it seems he just decided to ignore it all, as if he too was forgetting that this house was not his. And then, as if at an invisible command, Sunday, who had been silent before, suddenly spoke. Her words were full of unexpected frankness, and she began to share information that she had learned when we were dealing with inheritance. "Grandma left a lot of assets to me and Mom, but it's not money, it's things like land and apartments," she began, and I felt the atmosphere in the room immediately change. All the eyes directed at us became even more wary. When Kevin heard this, his face changed. I noticed his eyes brighten, and he turned to his parents with shining eyes, as if he finally realized that these assets could bring him huge benefits. "Wait, I had no idea your mother had so much wealth," he said, not hiding his surprise. "You never talked about it when we got married." Kevin's outburst led to his family immediately complaining about me, accusing me of selfishness and silence. "It doesn't look like an honest marriage," his mother exclaimed, glaring at me. "You deliberately hid it from us so you wouldn't give Kevin any property. What a greedy woman." The words sounded like insults, but I remained calm. I knew it wasn't my fault, and at that moment I felt how important it was to bring the truth to everyone. As Kevin and his family continued their accusations, my father-in-law, who was silent at the time, finally looked up and began to study the situation carefully. "Wait, what's going on?" he said, as if realizing something important. I nodded, explaining. "The inheritance is divided between Sunday and me. Only Kevin doesn't get anything. We found the will while sorting through my mother's things." These words were like lightning that cut through the tense atmosphere. Now everyone was standing in complete silence, and I could feel the tension growing with each passing moment. After hearing all this, Kevin's family turned red with anger, and especially his mother, who literally boiled with rage. I couldn't help but notice how her face was contorted with anger, and her voice was getting louder and sharper as she started to scream. "This cannot be allowed." Her words sounded like an accusation. "We will get divorced, and then I will definitely receive compensation from you." Her anger and disappointment were so obvious that I couldn't ignore this moment. Instead of succumbing to her pressure or engaging in useless debate, I just answered without thinking. "Yes, I agree to the divorce," I said firmly, without showing the slightest hesitation. When these words left my lips, her face instantly changed, and she just didn't seem to know how to react to such a turn of events. Without any warning, at the same moment she turned around and ran, as if eager to leave the door and go to the nearest city administration to get a divorce form. I didn't even try to stop her. I watched her figure disappear over the threshold, retreating with a furious step. At that moment, I felt strangely relieved, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from me. It was clear that it was inevitable that this moment had come. My gaze slid to Kevin, and I noticed how, standing next to him, he looked completely dumbfounded, as if he had just encountered something that he could not understand or accept. "What are you going to do now?" "What is it?" he asked grumpily, his eyes twinkling with displeasure, and there was an irritated tinge in his voice. "Are you seriously talking about a divorce or where you're going to live now?" It was as if he couldn't decide which of these was more important to him. I just looked at him calmly, not letting him know that his words had somehow touched me. I pointed to the house we were standing in and said with obvious calm confidence, "Actually, this house is already on the market." His face paled instantly, and he didn't seem to know how to react to my words. He exchanged glances with his father, but still continued to look at me with complete bewilderment, as if I had suddenly spoken in an unfamiliar language. Of course, he could not have expected such a turn of events. "What do you mean?" he finally muttered, clearly not realizing the seriousness of my statement. His eyes were blazing with displeasure, as if he didn't understand what I was trying to tell him. I knew he wasn't ready to accept this scenario, but what I said only made everything clearer. He didn't seem to be trying to understand. He still couldn't understand that I was just ready to let go of this house, all these things that he had tried so vainly to appropriate for himself. I wasn't going to play by his rules. A few more days passed, and again we were alone in my mother's house, where everything that could be called catharsis was happening. Sunday and I were the only ones who knew what had happened, and despite the sadness, we managed to get through this moment. I continued to move forward confidently, and Sunday seemed to be supporting me more and more. That evening, as Kevin and I were both sitting in silence after his irritated silence, Sunday suddenly spoke up. She spoke softly but confidently. "You've always said that you feel sad when you're ignored as the head of the house or when you come home tired from work, but don't you think there's a reason why you're being treated like this? Why don't you understand that you are neglecting us and humiliating us?" Her words, full of determination and truth, sounded so loud that I could feel them echoing in the air. Kevin turned pale, as if he had been struck by lightning. He just froze, looking at her, and his eyes couldn't understand what he had just heard. But Sunday didn't back down. She met his gaze, and in her eyes I read the determination that I had been missing. It was something new, something unusual, but true. Sunday finally dared to say what she really thought, and it changed everything. She finally opened his eyes, and I felt how it would have consequences. Kevin was completely speechless. He couldn't say anything, and at that moment I thought that if he had just silently signed the divorce papers, it would have been easier for everyone. I wouldn't have had anything else to say to him. But before I could think, Nicole suddenly blurted out something shocking that I couldn't handle. If I had known that all this would lead to such a finale, I probably would not have bothered with repairs, would not have spent so much effort and time to put everything in order. I didn't think that every detail, every dusty shelf and every sparkling window would play a role in this big and intense performance that unfolded right before my eyes. But, alas, time cannot be returned. All I could do was watch how everyone in this room reacted to something completely unexpected. When Nicole spoke, everyone fell silent. She said her words as if it was a perfectly normal and completely justified decision, as if no one should be shocked by it. No one expected that she would utter these words with such ease and without a shadow of doubt. The statement she made confused us, and it seems that each of us was trying to comprehend her motives, and with each new moment the shock became stronger. "If I'd known it would come to this, I wouldn't have bothered with repairs," she said, as if not noticing that everyone in the room felt uncomfortable with her words. I couldn't believe what she was saying. I was surprised not only that Kevin and my father-in-law did not know about Nicole's actions, but also how easily she could decide on such an audacity without consulting anyone, without facing the fact. Nicole's every word sounded like an excuse, as if she didn't see anything terrible in it, nothing reprehensible. "Why did you do something like that without permission?" My father's voice rang out. He was furious, and his words sounded like a bolt from the blue. In front of him, Nicole didn't seem to feel the slightest bit embarrassed. She calmly, almost carelessly, began to justify herself. "I wanted to live in my perfect room," she said, as if trying to explain her actions. "So I thought, why not take over this house and renovate it while we're at it?" "But you're selling it." "Yes, oh, but if you're selling it, why not repair it and sell it for more?" Her words sounded as if she was talking about something completely ordinary, as if it was a simple, insignificant matter. At that moment, I felt the weight on my heart become unbearable. Sandy, who was standing next to her, also sighed. We were both stunned and alarmed. It was something completely unacceptable, and it was obvious that she and I weren't the only ones who felt it. Even Kevin and my father-in-law, who seemed to be ready to support any of her actions from the very beginning, now began to feel the same way. I saw Kevin clench his fists, his face tense with suppressed anger. He couldn't stand this recklessness anymore, this naive confidence of Nicole that she could do anything and no one would object to her. At some point, unable to tolerate her equanimity, he finally broke through. "Hey, that's enough!" he exclaimed, almost shouting, his voice sounding angry and determined. "Even if it were to be sold or become ours, you should have told us first. Were we preparing to move to where we were supposed to live during the renovation?" His words sounded irritated, but they were also right. He finally expressed what we all thought but couldn't articulate. Nicole seemed so surprised by his words that she didn't know what to say. There was a moment of confusion on her face. But before Nicole could answer, we saw her. My mother-in-law, out of breath, ran into the room as if she was urgently attracted by something. She was holding some documents in her hands, and everyone understood that these were nothing but divorce papers. She obviously didn't know about the quarrel, but the moment she walked in, nothing mattered anymore. "I got them," she shouted, handing the documents to me. "Divorce papers. You're going to sign it right here." Her words were full of excitement, but at the same time I noticed how pleased she was with herself, as if she had brought victory, as if an important battle she was fighting with us was being decided. Without hesitation, I took the documents from her hands and handed them to Kevin. My fingers trembled slightly, but my gaze remained steady. "Are you writing this after everything that happened? After all the times you've humiliated me?" I said softly but confidently, not letting my voice waver. Kevin, standing in front of me, immediately refused. His face paled, and I saw his jaw clench sharply, as if he lacked words. He probably knew about my mother's inheritance, and that could have influenced his decision. But I couldn't stand his behavior anymore, his strange antics and endless manipulations. I felt that this time I had to act decisively. I didn't back down. I provoked him by trying to get him to sign these documents in order to end all this once and for all. So suddenly, changing my tone, I uttered words that had remained in me for a long time, but now that the moment of truth had come, sounded more firmly than ever. "I think you've been in a good mood lately because you've been thinking about taking over my house. He's so badly set up even without my mother's inheritance. And you know, I wasn't going to give it to you, and by the way, it was already scheduled for sale anyway. You will, how should I say it, remain homeless, and this is not because of me, but because of your actions." With these words, I felt the air in the room become tense. Everyone froze. Kevin, with his bitter expression, didn't even try to hide his anger. He took the divorce papers, and his hands shook as he tried to control his irritation and calmness at the same time. It was as if he was trying to swallow the bitterness, but despite this, I knew that my words, spoken with such confidence, shook him. I knew exactly what I needed to say. I knew his weaknesses too well, his vanity, his ability to appear indifferent to hide the pain. These words that I uttered were not just manipulation, they were a response to many years of humiliation and underestimation. I knew for sure that if I could persuade him to sign the documents, It would not only be an act of liberation for me, but also perhaps his last chance to see the consequences of his actions. Kevin looked at me with such contempt, as if I had no right to make such statements to him. His face turned red with anger, and he abruptly snatched the divorce papers out of my hands, starting to fill them out without saying a word. He signed them like a man who couldn't stand a single word anymore. "If you insist, I'll give you a divorce," he said through clenched lips, his voice sounding almost distant. I felt relieved by his hasty actions. I was a little afraid that he would change his mind, that with every look and gesture his anger would fade and everything would return to normal. But no, Kevin was simple and straightforward, as always in his decisions. He wasn't going to waste any time. I filled out my part of the documents, confidently crossing out the lines and filling in all the empty lines. I wasn't going to allow any more hesitation. I wasn't going to compromise anymore. All that remained was to hand over the documents to Sunday and complete the process. I couldn't stand him or his family anymore. I handed over the documents to Sunday and returned to Kevin's family, but I couldn't avoid thinking that this process was still incomplete. All that remained was to send everything to the city office, and then, perhaps, it would all finally end. "Okay, take all your stuff," I said, as if it didn't matter. "You've already finished your business, so please leave." But in response, I heard the indignant voice of my mother-in-law. "Wait a minute. Are you serious? You said you'd be relieved if Kevin signed these documents." "That's right, but you never said you'd agree to move." "What about repairs? Where are the repairs?" Her words took me by surprise. I looked at her eyes full of bewilderment and concern. She obviously did not know anything about what was being discussed without her, as if she had been deprived of this knowledge at the last moment. She did not understand that everything had been decided a long time ago, and that her intervention no longer made sense. At that moment, Kevin and my father-in-law, as if sensing the instability of the situation, tried to intervene, but I knew that this was not necessary. I was already ready to leave with Sunday, to avoid further discussions. But as it turned out, I was in too much of a hurry. Kevin and Nicole didn't let us just get out of this mess. Nicole seemed to be trying to challenge my actions, and it was at that moment that her voice became loud, full of indignation. It was something that should have been completed right away, but suddenly her argument was interrupted by an unexpected sound. Movers were entering. They stopped in the doorway, watching the situation, and I felt anxiety engulf the space. Everyone was on the verge of exploding, and now it seemed that not a single step could be taken without consequences. We heard the sound of police sirens, which quickly filled the space, piercing the silence with such insistence that a sense of inevitability hung in the air. I looked around, and my gaze came across a group of neighbors who, having gathered to the side, lined up at their doors. One of them must have called the police, attracted by the noise we made in our house, and now, in the dark horizon outside the window, flashing red lights flashed. At that moment, as it often happens, we felt relieved. However, this relief was very brief, when suddenly, at the very second when salvation was already on the horizon, we realized that Kevin's whole family, which had not stopped until now, was literally preparing to attack us. And while emotions were boiling and words were pouring down like hail, the police intervened. We finally felt safe. However, the calm did not last long. The police, despite their obvious authority, could not immediately stop the storm that broke out in Kevin's family. The tension was so great that another officer had to escort us to a police car to calm the situation down somehow. We headed for the car, and at that moment, Nicole, in her clumsy attempt to intervene, decided that we were going to be arrested, and rushed back into the house with the bags. But the police did not slow down and, acting instantly, stopped her, and then additional support appeared, which finally suppressed all the riots. When, finally, the anger of Kevin's family subsided, and we felt that the situation had somehow stabilized, the police asked us to follow them for further investigation. Nicole, who seemed to have completely lost control of herself, began to behave even more inappropriately. She tried to make a real scandal, claiming that her rights were being violated, and perhaps she made up something else. This was the last straw. Following her and Kevin, who also showed aggression in his rage, the officers arrested them for obstructing the performance of official duties. This time they couldn't escape. Kevin and Nicole were quickly taken away in police cars, and their parents, who desperately tried to intervene, were also scolded by the police and taken for questioning. We stood side by side and watched what was happening from a police car, where we were asked to make a brief statement. It all looked like a scene from some kind of nightmarish performance, where every act, every word, seemed to have no end, and we, ordinary viewers, were forced to wait until this bad performance was over. Kevin, who had once resisted our divorce so fiercely, now found himself in the midst of all this storm, with a helpless expression on his face. Even after the documents were signed, the divorce, which he tried his best to avoid, dragged on. However, thanks to the intervention of some liars, it still managed to be completed more or less smoothly. Shortly after that, when my house was sold, I felt as if a huge weight had finally been lifted from me. The buyer came quickly, much faster than I expected. By the time I was able to get the money from the sale, Nicole, as always, insisted on repairs, claiming that everything could still be improved. But as I said, the house was already renovated when my mother handed it over to me, and I wasn't going to reopen old wounds anymore. The buyer was satisfied, and the transaction was completed quickly. Kevin's family, despite the fact that they were not prosecuted, found themselves in a much worse situation. They lost their home, hoping that they could return to mine. But now they, deprived of housing, have become living evidence of how their own actions have turned against them. And although they were still counting on some claims of their own, I knew that they would not be able to return here, to the house that has now become mine, the house that I deserve. In addition, due to the unrest caused by this incident, Kevin's family became outcasts in society. Their name, which once could be associated with prosperity and well-being, now sounded like a synonym for scandal and betrayal. They were desperately trying to find a place to live, but because of the scale of the noise they made, it was inevitable. Everything around them, from their social circle to their jobs, reminded them that their actions had not been without consequences. In their lives, there was no longer that easy and carefree existence that they loved so much, and now, their every step was saturated with echoes of the past. My claim for compensation, which I filed in court, only made their situation worse. Every word, every gesture they tried to make to justify themselves, drove them deeper into a corner. The incident, which became widely known among Kevin's colleagues, led to a reduction in his salary. Now he was forced to work in a regular, far from well-paid job in order to at least partially cover compensation payments. His new life became gray and monotonous, full of disappointments and hard work. Even with all the efforts he made to make ends meet, he still had to combine several jobs to keep up with the payments. Nicole, despite all the consequences, continued to work in the beauty industry as if nothing had happened. She tried to maintain her former luxurious lifestyle, ignoring the fact that her savings were melting away before her eyes. At some point, rumors about the incident somehow reached her clients, and then the top management, which eventually led to her dismissal. Now she, like Kevin, found herself in the same situation, working several jobs trying to survive. The feeling of helplessness, which had to be hidden behind the appearance of a successful career, destroyed her inner world. The situation was difficult, but she understood that her actions had also led her to this. As for my in-laws, their lives also changed after that incident. It all ended in divorce, which was a hard blow for the whole family. My mother-in-law has now lost her part-time job. Her restraint and attempts to justify her daughter's actions could not hide the changes that had occurred to her reputation. My father-in-law, who dreamed so much about retirement, was now forced to allocate most of his savings to compensation payments to me. His dreams of a peaceful old age had been shattered, and now, despite his age, he was looking for a job, trying to cope with financial difficulties. Each of them found themselves in a difficult situation, but it was their own consequence for the actions they had so thoughtlessly committed. They paid the price, but I was no exception. Sunday and I, in turn, moved into a new house. The move became our symbol of change, our new beginnings, and the final victory over those who tried to break us. Even if Kevin's family decided to approach Sunday's school, it didn't matter anymore, because she had changed her place of study a long time ago. We no longer had to hide, or fear that someone would interfere in our lives. We started living by our own rules. My work from home was now satisfying, and I finally felt like I could breathe freely. I could focus on Sunday, on creating a safe and cozy corner for us where we could live in peace and enjoy every day. I was starting to think about spending our upcoming days in peace and quiet. It's just the two of us, leaving all the hard memories in the past, like pages that we no longer open. We didn't have to look back anymore. We were moving forward, forever freed from all those worries and problems that plagued us before. Every morning, when I woke up in a new house, I felt like I was getting rid of the past. In the end, amid all these storms, Sunday and I were the only thing that really mattered.